It's kind of a balance, like there are definitely moments in episodes where okay, we're going to use a bigger name artist or the director's really attached to this specific song that's going to cost us like 40 grand, which
Okay.
means we've got to use indies or baby
Mm,
artists or do more of a blend between the episode within the episode and probably within the season. Which
mhm.
I like doing better. I think it's more interesting. I think it's boring to just use music that everybody knows and has heard a million times.
What's going on? Welcome to the New Music Business. I'm your host, Ari Herstand, author of How to Make It in the New Music Business, the book. Third edition is out now in all formats, audiobook, hardcover, ebook, however you like to consume books. You can find the book anywhere. Today, my guest is Brittany Douziech. She is a music supervisor, and she has worked on projects like From Scratch on Netflix or Hulu's Life and Beth, which we spend a bit of time talking about today. Season 2 just came out. Amazon's A League of Their Own, and Daisy Jones and the Six, along with a few films. And we kind of dig into all things sync licensing today, music supervising, all of that. So whether you're an artist or a manager or an indie label or publisher or someone who's interested in getting your music placed in TV shows, or you're someone who's actually interested in becoming a music supervisor, we talk all about that today. We talk about what TV shows are paying, kind of some of the budgets that you're looking at, how this all works, how music supervision actually works. So if you want to know a little bit of behind the scenes of how songs get placed in TV shows, Brittany really steps you through all of this, kind of from start to finish, and just kind of how the whole process works. It was a really informative conversation. I really enjoyed and appreciated Brittany's transparency, and everything she brought. I do want to give a shout out. If you are interested in sync licensing, check out Ari's Take Academy. We have a course on sync licensing taught by arguably one of the most successful artists in the sync space, Vo Williams. He's had over 3,000 placements, sync placements of his own music. He's the instructor for this course. And we've helped get around 200 of our students signed with sync agencies, sync agents. And Brittany will talk a little bit more throughout the episode of how and why she appreciates and works with sync agents. So if you're interested, go check out aristakeacademy.com and check out the sync licensing course. You can find Brittany on IMDb. Just search her name, Brittany Douziech. That's spelled Douzich. You can also visit BrittanyDouziech.com or find her on Instagram. You can find all of us that make the show happen at Ari's Take on Instagram, TikTok, X, and Threads. You can find me at Ari Herstand on Instagram. And visit aristake.com and get on the email list. That is where we're going to send the most up-to-date relevant info about the new music business. That's how you can stay in touch. But right now, if you could just pause this episode, leave us a 5-star review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or however you're listening to this. If you're on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, leave us a comment, and click the follow or subscribe button if you want these episodes and the show to continue in your feed. All right, let's kick into the show. Brittany Douziech, welcome to the show.
Hello. Happy to be here.
Hello.
Thank you for having
Yeah.
me.
Absolutely. So I'm excited for this conversation because sync licensing is one of the most popular topics for this audience, for the new music business audience, and for just kind of musicians, indie artists in general. They hear how lucrative it can be, and they hear how life-changing it possibly can be. They hear about the stories of artists, blowing up from various sync placements or something like that. And we've had various music supervisors on the show. But for people that aren't familiar with sync licensing or music supervision, I would love for you to just explain, from your perspective, just help people understand what you do. What is a music supervisor, and what does a music supervisor do?
Oh, that's such a big question, and I love
Uh-huh.
answering it. We do so many different things, and it really depends on the type of project that it is. You know,
Okay.
sometimes it's just consulting and saying, "Hey, you got to license this song. Somebody owns it. You can't just fair use everything in a documentary film." It's something like a low lift like that.
Uh-huh.
To helping source composer options and working with them to create like a sound palette for a project. It's also selecting music that could fit within a scene for a film or a TV show. And then, figuring out who owns the rights, negotiating the rates, and the terms. And
Mhm.
sometimes that takes a ton of research to figure that out who represents those musicians. Um, and, putting together creative ideas, doing on camera work, if there's original music, an original song, like sourcing artists, maybe booking, studio space, creating songwriter camps for original music. It can be a pretty heavy lift, and the, specific functions vary based on what the project needs.
You had me for everything up until you mentioned songwriter camps. I was under the impression that songwriter camps was primarily kind of a music publisher's job, or sometimes sync
Sure.
agencies will put together songwriter camps. Where do music supervisors fall into this songwriter camp realm, and what is your involvement with it? I mean, are you organizing them? Are you kind of attending them to help with the songwriters, bringing briefs to the camps? Tell me more about that, because I've never heard a music supervisor talk
Mhm.
about a songwriter camp before.
So I would say that's usually only the case on a like very music heavy show, like on Daisy Jones and the Six. Frankie
Sure.
Pine, who was like the music supervisor on that.
Hmm.
She did a writer camp but it was just with, like a very specific group of writers writing for the show, writing for the original
Right.
music.
Right.
Um, so in
Gotcha.
that case, like we're heavily involved in that. We're going to those sessions, we're selecting who's a
Mm.
part of that, helping to craft the song, and kind of teach people how to be a band sometimes.
Were you doing that? Are you teaching them how to hold a microphone and all of that, and how to work with the music?
Yeah. Be real cool like this. This is how you do
Yeah,
it.
right, right. Cool. Okay, no, that makes a lot of sense, because Daisy Jones and the Six was so music focused. For those that are not familiar, the show is about a fictional band in the 70s. Um, and yeah, and with all original music for that band. And I know, if I'm not mistaken, I think Blake Mills was a big part of
Uh-huh.
that, kind of co-writing and producing a bit. Blake Mills was producer for Alabama Shakes, and he's in Fearless Flyers and stuff like that. So very cool. So but kind of for shows that aren't as music centric, I guess, or shows that aren't about a fictional band with original music, because I think that's more of an anomaly. Um,
Yeah.
let's talk more about let's start with the fun part of the job of kind of choosing the music. How does that process work? When let's first talk about a TV show, and
Uh-huh.
just kind of step me through when you come into the process, and what those conversations are like, and how you choose the music. Is like the director or the writer saying these are the songs we want, or do they say, hey, where do we put music? And then you come in and be like, oh, I think music would actually fit over this scene, or something. Like, kind of step me through the whole process of how that works.
Yeah. It's kind of a mix, like sometimes things are
Okay.
written into the script and sometimes those things are like not realistic gets, like the Beatles or something like that.
Sure.
And that's, where we come in, but we also do script spotting, which is basically like reading through a script and flagging moments that we think music would naturally be, like source music on the radio or in a car, but
Cool.
also, where we think there could be like a highlighted musical spot, that could just add emotion to a scene. So there's a,
Hmm.
a little bit of that. And there's also, talking with a showrunner or director to kind of get a sense of what their vibe is for each scene.
Mm.
Like, do you want music here? This is what I think could work. What are you thinking? There's, definitely like a good collaborative conversation, ideally. there is.
Hmm.
You
Okay.
know, not always the case, but
Sure.
that's generally what happens. And then, you know, we work really closely with editors too. And they sometimes have you know, a very big say in what gets chosen or what they think the appropriate vibe is for a show or a
Hmm.
specific scene. So, you know, you've got to be flexible and I would say kind of like take your ego out of the process to a degree. Like it's
Mm.
whatever best serves the project. And like ultimately, I can think something is amazing, but if it doesn't fit with the creative vision of whoever's running the show, like I've got to, you know, function within those parameters. So
Yeah.
it can be tricky.
When Sure. When you come into a project, like a TV show, let's say you come in kind of at the very beginning, early on, are you kind of part of, before the show airs,
Mhm.
are you part of kind of helping create a sonic palette, for instance, of the show, or how does that work?
Ideally, yeah. I think most of the time people are really open to that, you know? I think
Okay.
people come in with a very loose sense or music's really honestly just an afterthought. So generally people love talking about music or to have some kind
Sure.
of guidance. So it's nice to be somebody that people can lean on, you know, or
Hmm.
and you can kind of help guide them to what makes sense, you know, creatively and budget for the budget, you know,
Yeah.
because
Yeah,
that's
I'm
a whole
curious
other
these
thing.
days kind of where a lot of these TV shows are, in terms of the types of music they place, and if there is even a sonic palette. Like for instance, just to uh, kind of expand a little bit on what I mean by sonic palette. My first big sync placement was about 12 years ago in the TV show One Tree Hill.
Nice.
I had never seen the show. Lindsay Wolfington was a music supervisor.
Uh-huh.
I'd never seen the show. People were watching the show and said, "Hey, Ari, this show uses a lot of singer songwriters, music that sounds like you." And I was like, "Oh, that's interesting." I didn't know that TV shows did that, like used very similar music. I had no idea what was going on at the time. And I just was like, oh, well, let me see how I can get my song on the show. And in the end, I ended up tweeting a song to Lindsay Wolfington, and she ended up placing the song. I mean, this doesn't happen
Awesome.
anymore, and we've since talked about this. She came on the show as well. She's like, wow, I think you're probably the only one I've ever placed from a tweet. But like that show had a very distinct sonic palette, and Empire has a very distinct sonic
Okay.
palette that was not hip hop, and One Tree Hill was more singer songwriter, and there are those shows. There are certain shows that have that. Whereas, for instance, like Euphoria, for instance, we had Jen Malone on the show as well. Um, in one episode, there'll be a hip hop song and a country song and like an
Yeah.
Americana roots folk song back to back to back. And you're like, wow, this is all over the place. I'm curious from your perspective these days, um, where are you seeing the trends? Are shows kind of working with that kind of a distinct kind of sonic palette theme, or is it kind of like let's just place hip, trendy, interesting music? Or yeah, step me through that process and where we're at.
Well, that's a tough one. I think there's definitely a trend of shows who try to be solid like that and have consistency among, you know, between episodes or within the episode
Okay.
of a sonic palette. I think that's really cool. Um, but I would say it takes a lot of dedication from whoever's directing or show running to be
Mm,
mindful of that. And this is the intention I want and how I'm going to carry it through every
okay.
episode. I don't know if that's as important to other shows or as essential, to be honest. You know, I think most shows jump around and it kind of just, you know, it's whatever fits the scene. And also, like, I was going to mention all the CW shows, including One Tree Hill. they all follow very similar sonic roadmaps of that like
Interesting.
singer-songwriter, you know?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So when artists like that
Yeah.
hit me up, I'm like, you know where to go first.
Yeah. Is that still happening over there? I don't know. I've kind of stopped paying attention. But
Uh,
yeah. So cool.
you know, I'm not like the biggest CW viewer, I would say.
Yeah.
Probably not my demo, but yeah, I think it's still a solid selection.
Cool. Good to know. Good to know. Maybe I'll pitch a few more songs over there. Figure out
You
what shows are
should.
happening. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So let's kind of going back into that process of when you come in and how that works. You said you kind of will work with the editor. You might work closely with an editor.
I
Talk to me
will.
about the difference between music that you license, you place, and you're kind of in charge of versus what the composer is in charge of. And if you could just kind of explain a little bit and distinguish between kind of the score, the music on a TV show that comes from the composer versus the music on a TV show that comes from you and other artists.
Yeah. So, I mean, the music that a supervisor places, it's usually from an artist or a band.
Hmm.
We're usually dealing with a label and a publisher. It's something that's like a source cue or it's a featured musical moment where there are
Hmm.
lyrics, usually, not always. Um, and
What
it
does a
tends
source
to,
cue mean?
so a source cue is something that's like playing on the radio or if somebody's at a
Mm,
restaurant, it's in the background. It's like something you would naturally hear in the real world.
got it.
Um, but score, is generally used to support a scene or just, um, bring emotion to a moment without calling attention to lyrics. It's more like a little support, I feel
Gotcha.
like.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
And are there like at what I should say what part of the process do you come in for a TV show, and when does your work begin?
Um, the earlier the better. Uh,
Okay.
I also worked in house at a TV for a TV production company, so I was brought in like to budget for pre-production, which was
Oh
amazing
wow.
to see every stage. But as when you're working as a freelancer, you usually don't get brought in really until post, maybe right before post starts, depending on the show. I mean, if there's
Hmm.
live musical performances, then yeah, you get brought on for pre-production or production to kind
Sure.
of, find music to clear for that or, find a band
Yeah.
that's going to be performing live. So, yeah.
Got it. So typically, if there's not a band in the show, you said you're brought in for post. That means after the show is shot, and I'm
Right.
assuming edited, maybe, or what is explain? We're talking to music people here. Talk to me. What does post mean?
Right. I
We're not
forget.
in
I'm like,
film. We don't we
I
don't we
know
don't
you're
do
right.
TV. Yeah, post is like mixing and mastering if we're talking to musicians. But that in film and TV, it means something very
That's way
different.
too late. That's way too late in
Yeah,
film
right.
TV.
Okay. What are we
Yeah.
talking here?
So post is basically like once we've gotten all the footage back from production when they're shooting, and it
Okay.
starts going to the editing team. And usually people like me get involved before they have, any scenes cut together. So that way
Mm,
we can have discussions about, what direction they're thinking for music. I can start to put together ideas and potentially build bins for the editing team. So that way, while they're trying to cut together scenes, they can pull from music that I've already given them and, you know, we can flesh out what's working, what's not working, where we've got to swap stuff, you know, massage
can you tell
things.
what does a
Or,
bin mean? You said he put together bins.
I mean, a folder.
I'm gonna be asking a lot of like, what does that mean that you said you're throwing a lot of lingo around, which is
Sorry.
great, but because you do this day in day out, and this is awesome
Yeah.
because everyone here is loving to learn. I love to learn. But I'm gonna ask you. I'm gonna be really annoying and ask you
No,
every
do
time you
it.
throw out a word that I don't know what it means. Because I'm not in that realm. So talk to me about bin. When you say you put together a bin, what does that mean?
It's basically folders of genres of music or moods of music based on whatever discussions we have or whatever I think the musical direction should be in a project.
Mm-hmm.
And then, they ingest those into whatever editing program they're working with. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Cool. So you put together a folder of music that you think would fit. Now, when you put together this and you send in songs or music or something like that,
Mhm.
um, and you mentioned earlier there are some source cues. Here we go. I'm gonna throw that
Got
lingo
it.
right back at you. I'm gonna do my best here to try to work with the lingo that we've learned so far. I feel like I'm in class.
You're doing great.
There are some source cues like where something's on the radio, so you're like, okay, we know that this is going to be when the person turns the dial. They're driving in a car on the
Mhm.
radio. A song starts playing. Now, do you just give them a folder of like, here's 20 songs that I think would be great for this episode? Or are you like, all right, this song or these maybe 3 songs I think could fit for when they turn the radio on that source cue. And then like these 5 songs might be good for the ending credits, or step me through a little bit more specifically of how this process works when you actually have a bin of songs that you want to send through.
Um, so I would say usually when the show's first entering the editing phase, if we do
Hmm.
put together bins or folders of music, it's kind of really broad. And then once we get into working with specific scenes,
Okay.
that's when I give them much more limited options. So yeah, it's maybe like
Mm,
3 to 6 options for a specific scene that I think could work that fit within the budget.
mm,
Um, and then yeah, it is a breakdown. Like, okay, this could work for a car driving by, or this
mm.
could work for the end credits, or
Yeah.
here's music for all the scenes that are based in the '90s, something like that. So
Gotcha. That makes sense.
yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned budget. Let's talk what that means when you say budget. And I'm going to. Well, first off, what do you mean when you say works within the budget? What does that mean?
Like on a show, we usually get an episodic budget. So there's, 100 grand per episode that we're allotted.
Okay,
And, there's wiggle room. You can like, if you spend less in one episode, you can spend a little bit more in
hmm,
another.
cool.
Um, Hopefully we get more money and then we can pay artists better. But,
Hmm.
so that's kind of the breakdown for TV. We have like a set budget that usually is a freelance music supervisor. You don't have much of a say in. It's kind
Gotcha.
of you get it, and it is what it is. But
And so you have, let's just as an example, you used
Mhm.
$100,000 per episode, and this is just for the upfront sync license fees that you would pay, and we're talking, you have a total of $100,000, and you have to essentially be able to license all of the songs for that episode
Mhm.
with that 100K, right?
Yeah, both the recording side and the publishing side. Yeah, yeah.
Right. And for people that aren't familiar exactly with how licensing and sync rights work, I'll just briefly explain it. When you said the
Mhm.
recording side and the publishing side, there's 2 copyrights to every recording. There's the recording copyright and the publishing, the composition copyright. Some people call this a musical work. And basically, the composition is all the people who wrote the song. They all have publishers. You have to
Mhm.
kind of clear it because they have to give you permission. And then the recording side is usually a record label or an artist themselves, if they don't work with a record label, that also have to give you permission. For some songs, I mean, especially some pop songs, there could be 10, 12 songwriters. And so that could be
Mhm.
like 10 or 12 different publishing companies and a record label. Um, and so if you have $100,000, talk to me about the kinds of music you're able to place, because my understanding was probably a lot of major labels and major publishers are not going to be going, if there's 10 songs, I'm just as an example, if there's 10 songs an episode, and each song you could theoretically kick $10,000 to. all in the publishing side and the master side. You know, do majors go for that? Is that pretty reasonable? Is like that what most people are doing, or do you like working with indie artists that would be thrilled to get $10,000 for their song in a TV show? Or talk to me about that process a little bit.
It's kind of a balance, like there are definitely moments in episodes where okay, we're going to use a bigger name artist, or the director's really attached to this specific song that's going to cost us like 40 grand, which
Okay.
means we've got to use indies or baby
Mm,
artists, or do more of a blend between within the episode and probably within the season,
hmm.
which I like doing better. I think it's more interesting. I think it's boring to just use music that everybody knows and has heard a million times.
Sure.
And you know, who doesn't love championing artists and
Yeah.
exposing them to a new audience?
Awesome. So give me a range, I guess. Typically, what you're seeing on TV shows of, because most of the people listening are indie. They're not
Sure.
with a major publisher, major label that are negotiating this on their behalf. And I think a lot of artists listening or managers listening would be interested to know what are the ranges that you're seeing that you're able to offer to indie artists for a TV show sync placement all in.
It also depends on, where the show is airing. That if it's a smaller network, their budgets are going to be crappy. If,
Okay.
if you're on a major network, as an artist, you should kind of have a sense like, okay, maybe I can negotiate up a little bit because their budget's probably
Oh,
higher on a major network show. It's not always the case, but I would say it can't hurt to ask for a bump if you're an indie. I've
okay.
seen fee ranges between, 2,500 to 15K for an indie artist. It just really
Cool.
depends. Yeah.
Sure. What is here I go asking you to define terms a little bit more. What does major network mean these days? Like was Netflix considered a major network? I know that's like a studio because the terms everything is so blurred right now with streaming. It's like
Yeah.
I would know if we were talking 20 years ago, like, oh, NBC is a major network and CW's cable, but like
Mhm.
I don't know what that means anymore. Is Netflix on the higher end and like uh ESPN on the lower. I don't really have kind of just kind of break that down a little bit.
That's a good question. Even as I was saying that, I was like, wait, there's all this variation in streaming. Like, how does that even make sense
Right.
anymore? Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's tricky because, Netflix ranges too. Sometimes their
Okay.
budgets are larger on specific projects and smaller on others. Um, or if it's a project that an outside company is making and Netflix is just acquiring the rights to it, that affects the budget.
Sure.
Um, and there's definitely a difference between streamers. I would say,
Okay.
like if you're streaming something from HBO, their budget's probably going to be better than like, like who can I say that's okay for me to
Peacock.
disclose? Yeah, or like
Paramount.
Paramount. Yeah.
Sure. Right. Paramount, I guess, is another one. Well, let's talk Hulu for a bit because I know you worked on Life and Beth, which is Amy Schumer's show and Michael Cera. And how is that? Not necessarily with the budgets, but I'm curious. Kind of how that process works. Specifically, I watched. So I just got back from New Orleans. I was there for
Oh,
Mardi
nice.
Gras a couple weeks ago.
Awesome.
I love New Orleans. I try to spend as much possible time there. I go there every 3 years to write the new edition of my book, and then I'm just like I
Or
have family that lives there, so I just like love the city. So I watched in season 2, I believe it was episode 2 of Life and Beth, the New Orleans episode,
Remember.
which was really fun. And I saw some friends with that. I saw Ben Jaffe at Preservation Hall Jazz Band,
Yeah.
and like it was cool because there was a lot of live music. And this is I'm one of the very few people that probably realize this, but I have the Preservation Hall jazz band record on vinyl, the That's It album, and so I
Oh,
know it
nice.
very, very well. And as I'm watching the show, I'm like, this isn't the recording from the album.
Yeah.
This actually sounds live. Talk to me about the process of when you're doing a TV show like that, where you're using real musicians, live music. Maybe step me through that episode and how that worked.
That episode, I mean, those 2 episodes in New Orleans were kind of crazy. We had to scramble to clear everything and figure out what songs people were going to perform. Like over the holidays when everything was shut down and no one was answering emails. And then
gosh,
we had like 3 weeks before we went to shoot, and we were still trying to figure out which Jimmy Buffett song he was going to play and if he was going to fly in for the episode. There was just a lot. But with the Preservation Hall, I know like there were a lot of concerns because we were like, should we just clear the backing, the original, just in case the sound doesn't turn out right? And how is that going to blend with the audio within the scene? Are we going to have to shoot this dry, or, like with no music? So that way we can just get the actors and then cut the music in later. We were all really nervous, but I mean, obviously the sound, if you've been to Preservation Hall, like it's great. Everything was mic'd appropriately and it sounded fantastic. And they were so nice and performed so many takes of that song. It was definitely like one of my career highlights to be there. So, yeah.
Oh, I bet. I mean, that place is so historic. And I loved, I mean, this is a little, I'm gonna diverge a little bit, but I loved that Ben Jaffe, who's in Preservation Hall, he's the sousaphone player, the tuba player, but he's actually, I believe, the founder of Preservation Hall Jazz Band. His parents owned the club, and he actually they wrote in a part of their story, like he actually did grow up in Preservation Hall, and that was like he was kind of taught, and they used his real name in it, and so it was cool, kind of blending the reality with the fantasy in that episode a bit.
Yeah, it was
and it was the real musicians. It was the real Pres Hall. Charlie Gabriel is in it, and who's like 91 years old these days. And it was very cool. And then so when you do something like that, just I want to get back to kind of the rights and stuff. I'm curious because there's the publishing doesn't change because whoever wrote the song, whether it's being performed live or on the record or whatever. So you'd clear from the publishing company or those that wrote it. And then when it's live, how does that work? Who are you clearing the rights for a live recording from?
I mean, technically nobody. Like it kind of counts, or it can count as a new recording that's, being done by the production. So you don't.
So they own it.
I'm sure there's circumstances where, somebody's connected to a label or something, and they probably have to discuss who's going to own portions of the, the recording or the new recording. But in our case, thankfully we didn't have to do that.
Gotcha. Yeah. They're indie, and there's no like probably re-recording clauses in their own independent contract that, they don't have to do a Taylor's version. Right.
Yeah. Ben owns the publishing rights. So it was very easy.
Yeah. It's very easy. That's cool. Nice. So, okay, that makes sense. And I'm assuming for Daisy Jones and the Six, nothing was performed live. It didn't seem that way. It seemed like they were all lip syncing to everything.
Yeah, I don't remember. I kind of got brought in when we were like, right when they finished shooting and we were moving into the editing phase. So yeah, I'm not exactly sure. I feel like they didn't perform live. But yeah, I honestly right now.
No, they didn't. I could just tell by as a musician watching it. I mean, it was unless they like, I mean, little acapella things here and there, but it was
for sure not.
It was very polished. I'll say. And so it sounded like they probably did it, and unless they added a lot of Melodyne and in post and everything from the live stuff. But it was. But anyway, talk to me about the. I know there was. Now I'm blanking on. I didn't write it down what the show was, but the Norah Jones, Hank Williams song
Oh
that
yeah, that was in
she
Life of
kind of
Beth.
record. Oh, that wasn't Life. Oh yeah, that's right. That was
Yeah.
later in the season. And so talk to me about that because I noticed that the recording that was over the end credits of this Norah Jones recording of this Hank Williams song, it wasn't the actual recording from the record. However, she wasn't playing it live in the show. It was like it. So did she record it specifically for the show? And if so, why? When you could have just used the recording of it.
Um, she did record it specifically for the show, kind of. I don't want to. I'm not going to say by accident because it was intentional, but we kind of didn't have another choice. We tried to clear the rights for the original, and no one knew who owned the rights. It was
Of the recording?
bizarre of the master recording. Yeah, there
It
was
says Sony Music on Spotify for that Hank Williams tribute album, but maybe is that not accurate?
no because
They just distributed it. Yeah, that makes sense.
yeah,
Okay.
and it's like part of it was released from Bob Dylan's imprint. I think it's called
Got
The
it.
Egyptian, and
Under
so
Sony. That makes
that
sense.
falls under
Uh-huh.
Sony. We hit up
Mhm.
both of them, and they were like, turns out no one included sync language in the original agreement. So that was tied to the recording. And we were like, are you guys serious? How could you release an
Yeah.
album without this is 2011, I think,
Yeah. Yeah.
Film, TV, music is not that young. Um,
Right.
so luckily she was already in the studio and Egyptian
Oh
was
wow.
just like, have her do a new master. She did it super quickly. And we were able to just clear that. But it was a long road to get to that point. We thought we were going to have
Hmm.
to pull the track out. We went through so many rounds of options, but that was the song that everybody thought fit the best. And it kind of worked out in the end, but it was a hot mess for a minute.
It sounds great, and she's such a pro. So
Yeah.
that's cool. And cool. So I want to transition a little bit into there's a lot of artists that are listening right now, and they want to get their music on TV shows, in
Mhm.
film. That they want to get synced. What is your recommendation? How would you encourage artists to kind of go about this? Do you work with artists directly? Should artists, hit you up and be like, "Hey, place my music," or like? So talk to artists for a second of just like your recommendation of how they should go about this.
Oh, that's a big question. I try to tell artists to, listen to what's being placed in film and TV and kind of get a
Okay.
sense of where their music makes the most sense and what genres that are being placed do they kind of identify with and create music for sync based on that. Because that's probably going to be what's going to get you most likely to be placed ultimately. Um, it's a combination of networking, hardcore networking. I would say it's music placements, a lot of who you know. If you're able to connect with supervisors, that's great. If you're able to work with the publishing company or somebody who pitches music to music
Mm-hmm.
supervisors, like a sync pitcher,
Mm-hmm.
who maybe you fill a niche that they don't have. You don't want to be like
Mm,
lost in a sea of people who all sound like you at the same sync pitcher. Like that's going to be so hard to break through. But
yep.
you got to do your homework and be cautious of who you sign with. You don't want to get lost, but
Yep.
I would say sync pitcher is super helpful. They're who we as music supervisors work with a lot. And, we trust them. We don't have to, no shade, but we don't have to deal with, hundreds of individual artists hitting us up because it's just so hard to, give our time to everybody.
Yep.
Even as much as we want to.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And some people
Yeah.
call sync pitchers sync agents or sync
Mhm.
licensing companies or something like that. And we've had a
Yeah.
bunch of sync agents on the show that kind of talk about that process. And it's nice to hear from your perspective that you do like working with sync agents, because a
Mhm.
lot of sync agents represent indie artists, and they're considered these sync agents can be considered, one stops, which means that you as a supervisor only need to make one stop around town and clear it with the sync agent, because they've already cleared all the rights for you. Whereas in our examples before, where you had to go figure out who owns the rights to the master, then figure out who all the songwriters are, and you have to talk to all their publishers. And so sync agents can kind of help streamline that process, and they've done all that work by the time they pitch you a song, I imagine.
Yeah. Yeah, which is super helpful, if we're in a time crunch,
Hmm.
having a one stop. So that, I mean, I guess that's the other thing that I would recommend for artists is making sure all of your stuff is buttoned up. Like you've got your splits figured out, you've got your song registrations cleaned up, like you know who the writers are and everything's neat. And
Hmm.
if you do sign with a pitcher, you have a co-writer or a producer who has a share of the writer share, like that they're not going to inhibit the approval process for getting your music placed. Because if I know, if it's difficult for me, I'm going to have to move on to the next thing if I don't have time to dig into
Mm.
this, and then you lose out on exposure and money.
That's
So
a really great point, to just have everything ready to go before you send out a song for consideration
mhm.
to you or to any music supervisor.
It's a hot look.
So yeah, 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 no, that's
Yeah.
great. You mentioned turnaround and time crunch. Can you kind of talk a little bit about for TV shows, or maybe let's just use Life and Beth
Mhm.
as an example, from when you kind of come in to the process for an episode or something like that. What is the time frame between you know submitting your bin to needing to clear the songs to when the episode airs? Or I guess it doesn't air these days if it's on Hulu. Drops, or
Yeah.
I don't know what they call it these
Drops.
days. Right, right.
I think the total process may be like a month between
Okay.
episodes or a month and a half between when that process gets started. Sometimes it's less time than that.
Okay.
Um, Once things are kind of temped in and we think a song might land somewhere, we start clearance early just to be cautious.
Mm,
But
mhm,
once we get rough cuts of an episode in particular, then we usually do spotting sessions where we all kind of watch the episode together, discuss the music, and if there's any
mm,
notes, if we need to swap things, like what's working for licensed music, what's not working for score, like, things like that. Um,
cool.
and we usually do like a couple of rounds of those. So we might do another round of those before everything goes into the mix, or when things are in the mix. That's like the final spotting session. Um,
Mm,
and that's like sound mix for, all the little tweaks, sound design and music.
sure.
Um, that's like the intense crunch time. So if people decide they don't like something creatively towards the end of that process, that's really when we've got to turn things around quickly, creatively and clearance wise. So we're
Mm,
dealing with a one stop or like a song that's an easy clear,
mhm,
where we have limited parties. We know that it'll clear within our budget. Like we're going to reach out to those
mhm.
resources and tap them to help us because
Gotcha.
we need the help.
Sure, sure. Um, who so once a song is cleared and is placed, and the episode's live, who actually pays the artist or the label or the publisher or the sync agent
Sure.
for the sync fee?
That would come
Do
from the
you?
production company or the studio. 'Cause I wish I could pay artists, but
Okay,
no.
yeah. Got
Yeah,
it.
usually like the production company or studio handles the licensing and payment process. Yeah.
Cool. And I guess changing gears a little bit, um, who you mentioned earlier in our conversation that you're a freelancer. I'm curious about how that works, and who hires you, and what does that mean to be a freelancer as a music supervisor on projects like this?
It's kind of like being, a writer or director or showrunner. It's pretty much the same. You kind of bounce around from project to project. It's,
Okay.
per usual, everything's relationship based. Um,
Okay.
so a music department at a studio would hire someone like me, or if I have a
Mm-hmm.
pre-existing relationship with a director or another a producer, sometimes they'll just roll you onto their next project, or
Mm-hmm.
they usually like to keep the same teams. Um,
Mm.
so it can be challenging for people like me to break in when everybody kind of keeps their little pods as they move
Hmm.
on through projects. But and then other times it's a producer that's hitting me up or a director. Um,
Mm.
and then they'll bring me into the studio project. So it kind of varies a bit.
Yeah, and there are challenges, and we had Madonna Wade Reed on the show as
Oh,
well,
nice.
talking about when music supervisors were attempting to unionize and
Mm,
attempting to be considered employees, like how producers or directors are, because for most shows and most film productions, nearly everyone who works on the production is a W-2 employee, except for a music supervisor who's a freelancer, like a 1099 freelancer. Is that right?
yeah.
Right. So you don't have a lot of the rights and a lot of the protections that everybody else on the production does. And I know that's an ongoing battle, and I know it's up and down. But so because yes, Hollywood is a seemingly like a freelancer kind of industry,
Mhm.
whereas shows start and finish, and that was a big thing that was part of the writers' strike last year. You know, seasons used to be 27 episodes
Yeah.
long, and now they're like 7 episodes long
Mhm.
sometimes, or 10. And so you're constantly having to hop around for from job to job to job. um and I guess from your perspective as a music supervisor, or the people listening to this who want to be music supervisors,
Mhm.
what would you tell them as to how they can kind of break in? How could somebody who wants to do what you do become a music supervisor?
I would say, depending on what stage you're at, if you're in college, make friends with the people in your film school or people who are making those projects, because hopefully
Cool.
you can go places together, you can work together, you can learn together. I wish
Hmm.
I would have done that when I was in college, but I went to college for something completely different. um,
What'd you go to college for?
Journalism.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay,
It was
great.
like music history related, but still,
There you go. Fun. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, on the periphery. Um,
Hmm.
I would say also try to find a mentor, like who's supervising the shows that you like. Most of the
Mm,
time people are willing to mentor you or at least meet with you to give you some advice. Um,
cool.
there's so many resources available now to learn about supervision, to find out who the key players are, even, mid-level soups, lower level soups, like people love talking about themselves. If you reach out to them, I feel like you'll at least get some kind of a response. Um,
Hmm.
especially if you show that you're doing the work to learn or that you're eager to
Hmm.
learn. Um, yeah, I would say mentorship is key. If you can
Hmm.
find an internship, it's not a super glamorous, well-paying job as much as people think that it is. I feel like 80% of it's paperwork and being hyper organized. So,
Sure, sure.
um, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
managing expectations and being prepared for a lot of boring aspects of a job, but it's still really cool.
Gotcha. That's great advice, and that's super helpful. And I know the people listening to this really appreciate that. I'm a systems nut. I'm curious, when you say be super organized, what are some of the tools that you use to help keep you organized?
I mean, Excel and Google Docs, those are like your best friends. We have to
Okay.
create project charts usually for everything anyways that track the various stages of music clearance or music licensing. And those can be really intense with a lot of data and information. And you have to
Sure.
usually do variations of those for different parts of the production and post teams. You
Mm-hmm.
have to collect a lot of assets like information for the end credits, information for the music cue sheet, um,
Mm.
high res music files, all kinds of things, but also organizing like your music library, which is
What do you
almost
use for that?
impossible. I use Disco.
Cool. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
kind of become the industry standard,
Hmm.
disco these days. So that's great. Yeah, disco, for people listening that don't know, it was designed by music supervisors, created by music supervisors, and is kind of the de facto industry standard of what everyone in sync licensing these days is using, from the agents, the publishing companies, to music supervisors and everything like that. So that makes sense. Cool.
Yeah. Also, I would
Um,
suggest, if you're able to, as an artist, to have a Disco account,
mhm.
and you can make an artist page there. It can look really pretty. You, you can include all your metadata there and your high res files. It's so easy to send us a link, and then we can just automatically ingest that into our Disco. It's seamless. It's how
Mm.
a lot of us send out playlists. So that's like a step above if you're able to do that.
Awesome. No, that's great advice. Yeah, very cool. Well, right on. Well, Brittany, this has been so informative and illuminating, and I know everyone listening to this really appreciates all of the wisdom that you bring in the transparency into kind of this elusive world of sync licensing. But it is, yeah, it's so fascinating. I have one final question that I ask everyone who comes on the show, and that is, what does it mean to you to make it in the new music business?
Oh man. Ah, I guess for me, it means being able to put music together to media that makes people feel something and it sticks with somebody. There's like nothing better than having a musical moment that creates that like nostalgia in your head, where every time you
Mm,
hear that song or that track or even that score, you're like, oh shit, I've got chills right now. And I'm transported into that place. You're like, why am I crying now? Because it reminded me of that emotion in that scene. So if there's moments where I'm able to do that in my career, that's super fulfilling. And if I'm able to like expose
awesome.
the world to diverse artists and, you know, people they likely would have never heard, that's always a plus. Yeah. That's my long answer.
Brittany, that's perfect. Brittany Douziech, thank you so much. That was great.
Yeah, thank you.
Today's episode was edited by Ari Davids, with music by Grassroots District, and produced by all the great people at Ari's Take.